It lasted between 14 and 16 years, but that's depending upon who you ask. But America's, for sure, largest, longest, most complicated war ever. It was also America's bloodiest, one of America's bloodiest wars ever. Number 3, but 211,571 casualties. That means casualties means killed, wounded, missing in action. The only other 2 wars that were bloodier was, of course, World War II, and then the Great American Civil War, and then maybe World War I. But after that, it was Vietnam, very costly, very complicated war. In fact, maybe the most complicated war ever. If we have time at the end of today's talk or presentation, if we've got time, I'm going to bring up McNamara. He was the Secretary of War for 2 of the presidents, and he'll summarize his opinions of why this was such a disastrous war for America. And then we've got a gentleman I know here who was in Vietnam 2 or 3 years, wasn't it? Yeah, he was in the Army, a captain in the Army. And so if you wish to say anything, you can. We'll see. He's a quiet guy. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, I call them chapters. I call it chapters. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, I move along that way. So let's start with what I call Chapter 1, and that's the history of Vietnam, part of the history of Vietnam. First of all, Viet, V-I-E-T, that means people. And then Nam, N-A-M, that means the people of Vietnam, indigenous people, who most of them born in Vietnam, although Vietnam was a colony of China for well over 1,000 years. And then they broke away somehow from China, and then over 1,000 years. And their independence from China came about in 1775. And lasted for a long time, as I say, over 1,000 years. And then it was colonized again, this time by France. And that was, I think, in 1698, something like that, France. Here you see what's called Indochina. And all 3 nations that you see here in gray are part of French Indochina. And that's when France colonized the peninsula there, and that was actually 1893. And tonight I'm going to only cover Vietnam. I'm not going to touch Cambodia, not going to touch Laos. There just isn't enough time. So at the end of, can you turn that up? That's it.
Well, we're trying to dim it for the screen.
Yeah, this screen here. Yeah,
There you go.
Can you see it from those angles?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. But I've got to see my notes. Okay, by the end of World War II, 1945, a famous man by the name of Ho Chi Minh, sometimes I'll just call him Ho, but Ho Chi Minh, communist leader of, in Vietnam, and he was a hero to most of the people in Vietnam, many of the people in that area of the world. Now, to make a very long story short, Ho Chi Minh and his guerrilla army, he helped to develop a guerrilla army. They seized the northern part where you see Hanoi, that area, just after the war came to an end. And right up there, if you can see it from different angles, Hanoi, one of the big cities in the north. And Ho, and again I'll call him Ho, he developed the northern area of Vietnam, the state of Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh. He became president of the northern sector. And then that left with an anti-communist regime in the southern part of Vietnam, and they were backed, of course, by the United States. The North was backed primarily by the Soviet Union and Communist China. Also, his success, he was a very successful guy, was based on nationalism, how he could blend nationalism with communism. And believe me, that wasn't easy, because the Vietnamese people have always been very, very nationalistic. But he did it. And his name, by the way, Ho Chi Minh, that was given to him when he was a child. And what it means is he who has been enlightened. And that's by his teachers who gave him that at about 4 or 5 years of age. The war was one of America's, as I mentioned, one of the most complicated wars ever, and not easy to study because it was so complicated. But before a series of, what I'll do is I'm going to use a series of outline dates to try to organize what in part went on, and along with some explanation on each one of these dates. So feel free during this part, if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand, but if at all possible, let's try to hold it, for the end. Okay, the following, it's an outline that I'm going to give you to create the sympathies and so on for myself as well as others. So let's start with the year 1920. And 1920, of course, Vietnam was a colony of Japan. Of the French. So Ho Chi Minh, he was one of the members of the French Communist Party. Several years he spent in exile, most of it, although some in the United States, some in Russia, most of it though in France. And then we jump to 1940 now, and in 1940, Japan now enters the picture. They invade Indochina. They occupy virtually all of it, but primarily Vietnam, because that's what we're talking about. And the French army, it was a large army too at that time, they were sent home or they were imprisoned by the Japanese. Then 1941, Ho Chi Minh, he returns to Vietnam and he forms the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh is a North Country army. Originally a guerrilla army, but ultimately it became a regular army, and they fought the Japanese. And then in 1941, the Viet Minh, they fight continually the Japanese, and then again with the help of, take a guess who, that they fought then the Japanese. It was the United States. The United States came to the aid and assistance of the communist forces fighting the Japanese. And then in 1942, Ho Chi Minh and a general that he meets, a General Giap, I'll talk about him later, G-I-A-P, he becomes military leader of the Viet Minh and the guerrilla forces in the north. And then, beginning in 1942, the Viet Minh, with the help of the United States, they're fighting the Japanese now. And one of the things that they did to help the United States was to rescue U.S. pilots that were crashed in the area, as well as supplying intelligence to the U.S. Army in that area. And then the United States, in return, gave them guns, the weapon to the guerrillas, guns, food, medicine, and so on. And now it's 1945, it's the end of World War II. Japanese, they're sent home to Japan, and then same 1945 again, the guerrilla army, they occupy, as I mentioned, the northern part of Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh now proclaims a provisional government in the city of Hanoi. That's 1945. And then 1945, as you know, World War II ended, and then 1946, French troops that had been imprisoned by the Japanese or sent home by the Japanese, 1946, they now return to help colonize again Vietnam. And they clashed immediately with the communists, especially communists from both North and South, and I'll talk more about that. So they were determined, however, to recolonize French Indochina. It was a very profitable thing for France. So 1949, in addition to the French army based primarily in southern Vietnam, a southern Vietnamese home army, let's call them that for the moment, is developed to help the French as well as work with the Viet Minh coming from the north. October 1949, the Cold War, 1947 actually, but in the middle of the Vietnam War, we've got the Cold War taking place. So U.S. leaders, from the spread of the fear of on the part of U.S. leaders, now the spread of communism. Everybody's afraid about that. And here they're witnessing possibly the spread of communism in South Vietnam. It's already began in North Vietnam. So January now, 1950, China, think about this, and the Soviet Union, they recognize now Ho Chi Minh, his democratic, his communistic Republic of North Vietnam. So that's what they called it. And they supply to the communist armies, they supply guns, more modern guns after a while, food, everything else. Now it's February 1950, and the war is not going well for the French army in Vietnam. They could not pin them down and kill them. It wasn't going well. French, they cannot, they can't cope with the hit-and-run tactics of the communist forces. So in November 1953, it became obvious, very obvious, that France was losing the war to the communist Viet Minh in the north and others in the south. And as a last-ditch effort, a general, French general, he was one of the top dogs there, it was his idea to create a giant fortress. And in the area of northern Vietnam, manned by thousands of French soldiers, including the French Foreign Legion, including some of the indigenous South Vietnamese forces. They had tanks, they had everything, modern equipment and all. And they dug and they created this mammoth building, or whatever you want to call it, a fortress. And it makes a long story very short, because this fight at Dien Bien Phu, it went on for 3 months. And they thought for sure that they would be able to, Dien Bien Phu would be bait for the Viet Minh, the communists, to bite on and take, no longer hit and run. And once they bite on this bait, the French soldiers, well equipped with everything, could now take advantage and kill them accordingly, and then that would help to end the communist side of the Vietnam War. It's March now 1954, about 3 or 4 months later. General Giap, quite a guy, he controlled the communist forces. And with over 50,000 of his men, Viet Minh primarily, under his command, more about him in a few minutes too, they overrun this giant facility created by France called a fortress. So they overrun it. That's Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu, by the way, was a villaged area in part of northern Vietnam, a pretty big area. So despite help from the United States, we gave them some limited help with aircraft. But despite that, 3 months go on. Most of them, French and many of the Viet Minh, are killed in the battle. By the way, this is one of the most famous battles ever, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And finally, the French have to surrender, and 11,000 troops are left. They're captured. They're sent to, marched to prisoner of war camps further north. Virtually all of them die in the process of marching.
What was the date of Dien Bien Phu's fall?
Dien Bien Phu is essentially 1954. Lasted 3 months. So the net result of all of this was that the French bargaining power, it's gone. No longer are they going to be able to colonize Indochina. And they quit Vietnam, and their troops, what was left of them, all of them, they go home to France. So the colonization now of Indochina, it's over. Okay, and this brings us to the Geneva Accords. Prior to this was the Geneva Conference, but this is what's important, the Accords. Can people in the back read that? Okay. So shortly after the defense of France, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva Accords, they were signed. And who signed them was the United States, Russia, Great Britain, and France, although France didn't have much to say anymore. I don't know why the China was not there. They had their own issues. They had just won a revolution in 1949 in China. So the 17th parallel, that's what you see, the horizontal line there, 17th parallel, all agreed that Vietnam was to be temporarily divided into the top and the bottom, bisected by that horizontal line. Temporarily, North and South would operate on their own. All agreed that North Vietnam, they would be temporarily governed by none other than Ho Chi Minh. He's backed heavily by the Soviet Union and now China. And then in South Vietnam, below the horizontal line, it was temporarily governed by a guy by the name of Diem, D-I-E-M. More about him shortly. Very anti-communist. Very religious, primarily Catholic, but he was liked by the United States because he was so anti-communist. They all agreed, here's what's important now, they all agreed, both sides, that in 2 years down the road, 1956, that elections were to be held finally, and to unify the North and the South into one Vietnam. The fact is, these elections never took place. It was instead continuous war. And that brings us now to this fellow, Diem, there he is. He was in power about 8 years, And it was at the Geneva Conference that the delegation, the US delegation, used him to be Prime Minister, that's what he was called then, of South Vietnam. And then Russia, the Soviet Union, probably China, of course, they wanted Ho Chi Minh to be the leader, president, if you will, of the North. Now the French delegation, by the way, they didn't have much to say because they had been defeated so badly, but they were there. But they knew this guy. They knew him well from previous years, and they told the United States, and they argued with the United States that Diem, incompetent, unstable, and very, very corrupt. But the US delegation won the decision to make him Prime Minister of South Vietnam. Probably two reasons. One, again, he was Catholic, but more important than that, he was a passionate anti-communist. Well, it didn't take too long, and Diem, he holds a rigged election. Against the suggestion of everybody, but he holds a rigged election in the South, calling for him to become president now, no longer prime minister. He wants to be president, and claims that he won this election. 98% of the people in South Vietnam wanted him. Obvious BS, but he became now president. Well, in the South Vietnam, it didn't take too long, and almost everybody became unhappy with this Diem, including his benefactor, the United States. He was corrupt, alienated many of the factions in the South, including famous factions, peasant factions, even the South Vietnamese army factions, alienated virtually everybody. Virtually everyone and many factions in South Vietnam, there were a lot of different factions in South Vietnam, and I'll touch on that in a minute. He would not allow regime change. Everybody knew that. He was there to stay unless he was killed or something like that. Meaning that elections 2 years down the road, very important to determine what do the Vietnamese people want. No elections, as long as he's president. That was for certain. So bottom line, as bad as it was in North Vietnam, because we have a revolution going on there, a communist revolution to convert very nationalistic people now to sympathize with communism. So it's not going that great, you know. But in the South, it was really bad because of his corruption and the cronies that he put into power and so on. And this is very important too. The NFL is formed in South Vietnam. The NFL, nothing to do with the football team, by the way. All of the following material now is leading up to heavy involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War. And the NFL, what it means is National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam. So that's the NFL. Now the mission of the NFL was to boot out Diem and to the so-called president of South Vietnam, and eventually their goal is somehow reunification with the North, to create one Vietnam, if at all possible. Because Ho Chi Minh, you wonder why they sympathize with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a hero in that area of the world. Almost everybody loved him, and if you're going to go with anybody, maybe that's the guy. At the beginning, the NFL, it was made up of at least 12 diverse groups in South Vietnam. Communists were part of the group. socialists, nationalists, religious people, all part of this group in the South. Democrats as well. All of these diverse groups, they had two things in common. One was they hated Diem and he had to go one way or another. And then number two, they emphasized Ho Chi Minh, what was to be done some way, somehow with Ho Chi Minh, because he remained a hero to many of the Vietnamese people, both north and south. So that's the purpose of the NFL. But the NFL, they had a serious problem at this point. Most of them were civilians. They weren't soldiers. They had no experience. Yes, sir?
I have a question. Listening to what you're saying thus far, what was the value of Vietnam to France and the United States, other than a landmass in Southeast Asia? Did they have any natural resources, or did they have any ports?
Natural resources, progressive people, hardworking people in a lot of instances, but they were part of colonization, and they made big profits in all regards. I have a list of them somewhere here, but lots of profits came to the colonizers. One of the colonizers in that area of the world happened to be France. And most of the colonialists in the world, United States was a colonist too, the Philippines. And we gave up voluntarily the Philippines. And Britain was a colonist and other nations were colonists. They all, after World War II, gave them up, with one exception, France. It was very profitable. Okay.
They're selling of rice, or what are they?
Well, there's rice, I don't know what else, but today, I'll tell you, this shirt is from Vietnam. Okay. So they're pretty progressive. They had a lot of natural resources. They were hardworking people, and so on. So as far as a colony, one way or another, were very profitable for France. Now keep in mind about France, they just finished a war in 1945 against Nazi Germany, and they had nothing. So colonies were very important. And they had many colonies through the world. Okay, the NFL, they had a serious problem though. And the problem was they had no military experience. These are civilians, for the most part. They didn't even know how to use weapons. So they're going to have to fight Diem and his factions. He's got an army, albeit corrupt, but he's got an army. He's got a large police force, also corrupt, but they knew how to use weapons. How is he going to compete against them? Well, an invitation now from Ho Chi Minh in the north is brought to their attention, and the NFL, many of them, they go north. And they're there to be trained in guerrilla warfare. After their training, they were to return to South Vietnam to fight Diem and his military and his police forces and so on. So that's the NFL. And they receive a new name. These people coming south who have been trained in guerrilla warfare, they've got a new name, Cong San Vietnam, the Vietcong. That's what they became, members of the Vietcong, a guerrilla army fighting primarily in the south. Now, very important, because the Viet Cong, which was a guerrilla army, they became the military arm of the NFL. Okay, next chapter. Next comes to question, when did the United States become officially involved in the Vietnam War? Now, this is debatable. When did they become officially part of the Vietnam War? Well, North and South, they're fighting each other from about 1955 to 1959 or so without direct U.S. involvement. But in 1959, now, in order to help the South Vietnamese army, they called them the ARVN, A-R-V-I-N, or the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, the ARVN. Large numbers of American military advisors now are sent over, and they come. And what happens now, and their purpose was to train this guerrilla, help train this guerrilla army, and the ARVN, and how to fight both the Vietcong and the Viet Minh. That was a group from the top. Some of them were coming down. They were experienced now soldiers coming down to help out the Viet Cong. Both the ARVN and their military American trainers now, they're attacked from the north by the Vietnamese trained army, some of the Viet Cong also, and that caused the first major casualties for the United States in Vietnam. And the war became a U.S. war, 1959 on a large scale. But according to here I've got it here, according to the War Department in the United States, because it's debatable when the United States came to the war, but they said, and we've got to listen to them, 1959 officially called the beginning of the American war in Vietnam, but triggered by these training soldiers. A large number were killed. The war, it's not going well for Diem's forces in South Vietnam. Even with American help, at this point, it's not going well. And Diem, he asks President Kennedy now, he begs President Kennedy, I need more help. And Kennedy finally agrees. 1961, he sends now heavier weapons to Diem. Even helicopters are sent over, although they have to be operated only by American crews, and other modern and larger weapons. So we begin now to witness the fact that the United States has begun to really increase its ante into the Vietnam War. However, despite all of this additional help from the United States, Diem and his army, the ARVN, they're still losing the war to the communists. And his popularity, it continues to decline, and it's declining now rapidly. Now, here are at least 2 examples of why Diem, he's going to have to go one way or another. So one is, most of the popular programs that the communists advocated was under French rule, under Diem's rule as well, was the disputed areas of Vietnam, and it was promised by the Viet Cong, but especially the communists, to take the land from the rich and distribute it to the poor, and it would be distributed free of charge. Obviously, the peasants who made up a large portion of Vietnam, both north and south, they were happy with this. There's no doubt about that. Free land. Large number of people are farmers there, were farmers there then. So guess what Diem does? Anyone he rules who receive free land, whether it's the past or the present, or even in the future, you have to pay for it. And not only are you going to pay for it, but you're going to pay taxes, and I want interest on the price. So this obviously persuaded the peasants or the peasant masses to support, in great part, the communists. And some of them even joined the Viet Cong. Another example causing many of the Vietnamese population to sympathize with Ho instead of the other side was the Buddhist population. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Diem, he hated Buddhists. Now here's the next chapter. The main religion in Vietnam was Buddhism. 70% of the population in Vietnam were Buddhists. President Diem, he was a fanatic religious man, Catholic. He appointed primarily Catholics in the positions of power. He hated, as I said before, Buddhists. This obviously angered the Buddhists. And this is what happens. When Buddhists assembled to celebrate the birthday of the Buddha, his police, Diem's police, they shoot into the crowd to disperse them. Children are killed. And here you see a Buddhist monk with a demonstration against the Diem government, and you see him protesting. He's 66 years of age, and he's surrounded in the background by monks and nuns. They pour gasoline over him, they ignite it, and other monks do the same in other parts of the south of Vietnam. And this picture goes to the world. Not only in Vietnam, but it's spread around the world. Other monks do the same, as I say, in pictures around the world. How does Diem respond now? What he does, he arrests thousands of monks and he kills hundreds of them. I wish I had more time to describe Diem's ruthless, his corruption of the government, which indirectly helped the communists. And suffice it to say that what was going on in Diem's government made him disliked by the majority and made Kennedy now, who always stood behind Diem, pushed him hard, finally understands that Diem will never be able to unite the North and the South against communism. Even the South Vietnamese army generals now, they don't like him anymore either. And in more than one instance, they tried to overthrow Diem. Kennedy finally gives the green light to the CIA, and he is overthrown, and in the process, they murder him. So that's the end of him. Here's the next chapter. The Domino Theory, very important in the Cold War, and especially in Vietnam. The Domino Theory helps to explain why there was 5 American presidents. Did you know that, involved in Vietnam? 5 American presidents. It's got to tell us something. Starts with Eisenhower, then came Kennedy, then came
Nixon first.
Johnson, and then Nixon, and finally Ford. 5 presidents involved. And this is why the domino theory becomes so important. So the domino theory, it argued, and you see it here, that if one domino is knocked over, in the meantime too, we're involved in a war, a Cold War with Russia and China. That's the background. So the domino, if it's knocked over like this one is, the rest are going to eventually tumble. And applying that theory to Southeast Asia, it was argued that if Vietnam is taken over, all of it, by the communists, the other countries in the region are going to fall, namely Laos, next door, Cambodia next door, Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, and Indonesia. All will fall. Therefore, strong anti-communist leaders, the United States, thought were necessary, and that's the explanation, one of the explanations of Americans' early involvement with Diem and even involvement in Vietnam. Cold War covering all of this stuff. Now don't forget this, at about the same time, remember, Korean War going on 1950 to 1953, the large Vietnam War now going on, 1959 to 1975. Then on top of that, as I said, you've got the Cold War taking place. So no wonder at that time that the Domino Theory was so pronounced, compelling to our presidential leaders. Let me read just of a couple. Here's President Kennedy. Kennedy, he became convinced of the Domino Theory. And here's what he said, and I'll quote him. If communism is not stopped in Vietnam, it would gradually spread throughout the world. End of quote. That's Kennedy. And he was determined to draw a line in the sand to prevent a communist victory in Vietnam. In fact, he told James Reston, at that time he was with the New York Times, I don't think he exists anymore, but immediately after Kennedy met with Khrushchev, head of Russia at that time, he fell to the realization, boy, we've got a real problem going here. He's worried about the Cold War, he's worried about Russian expansionism, other expansionism on the part of China. And Vietnam, Kennedy says, looks like the place today that we've got to begin and go after our enemies. So Kennedy, despite many warnings that Vietnam, it's a bottomless pit, it's a quagmire, many people told him, he increases America's ante into the war. More U.S. advisors, more troops coming, and more equipment, everything necessary to try to beat the communists. More equipment for the Vietnamese army, the ARVN, more modern stuff. And as I said, when Diem begged Kennedy for more heavy and more modern equipment, Kennedy anteed it up. And Kennedy, although agreed to help the ARVN, the Vietnamese army, to increase its size, he allowed them to go to 170,000. They started out with 40 or 50,000, but 170,000 strong. So it was Kennedy who was instrumental in finally overthrowing Diem, told you that, he and the CIA, and then replacing him with a military junta. So Diem's replaced with a military junta. What now Kennedy would have done after Diem was overthrown, we don't know, because he was assassinated 3 weeks later. And that brings us now to LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. He was also, like Kennedy, a supporter of the Domino Theory. And here's what he said. If we quit Vietnam tomorrow, we'll be fighting in Hawaii and then in San Francisco. This is what he said then. The Joint Chiefs, they're pushing him now to ante up higher. We've got to win this war, to give more, to try to slow down the communists who were gaining strength by the day. So after Diem was overthrown, the South Vietnamese army generals, they take over and trying to rule. Some of them were very corrupt, like Diem was. They tried and tried. But Johnson, he was worried because his election now, you know, he just became president a very short time. His election's coming up, and he's afraid to get involved with more soldiers being sent over there. And here's what he told his Joint Chiefs then, and I quote, he wants to get president, he wants to be elected. Just get me elected, and then you can have your war, he tells them. But pressure on Johnson, it increased harder and harder, but he was reluctant to really get heavily involved at this point until the election. But what he does is he starts to look around for something where he can implement hard punches against some of the Vietnam, some of the Vietnamese, Viet Minh and the guerrilla army operating in the South. And what he came up with was something called Operation 34, which was already in place. Now, I don't know much about that, but Operation 34. This was a highly classified U.S. program to cover military actions led by none other than the CIA. We'll get them involved, not me. The CIA will get them involved. Got to take a drink. Operation 34. It began in 1959, approved back in the Eisenhower administration, way back then. Kennedy allowed and approved the action as well. And both Vietnamese agents and teams of elite soldiers, Operation 34 was they were going into Vietnam both by air and by ships and trying to create trouble there, even assassinations. They conducted sabotage, assassinations, all intended to create havoc in the North Vietnam. Now, as part of this Plan 34, U.S. destroyers were operating in northern Vietnam waters, and they were the ones seeing to the ARVN soldiers getting into North Vietnam to create trouble, as well as some American specialist soldiers too. And this brings us now to the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. Here you see the American destroyer. It was called the Maddox. There's another destroyer in back of them. And as I said, they're operating in these waters, and they're using surveillance equipment and so on as to what's going on in the north. And then they're supplying sabotage and all of that stuff to get into the north. Gunboats, North Vietnamese gunboats now start to shoot at this ship, the Maddox. But no one was hurt. There was some very, very minimal damage that was done to the Maddox, none to the other destroyer, period. But Johnson now authorizes retaliation. He blows up this extent of how much damage and how many people were killed. There was none killed on our ships. And he's going to allow now some limited bombing against the North Vietnamese harbors. And LBJ and his advisory groups, they make the most of the attack on this ship. Nothing really, again, happened to it by pronouncing the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So that's what this becomes, the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. And that became the keystone, that's the keystone of heavy American involvement in the Vietnam War. For Congress now quickly ratifies the resolution, and here's what's really important. LBJ, he's no longer now, he's very confident with this, that he's going to win and he's going to do it by a large majority. So he now allows for escalation of the war. He even went on TV and told the American people that we're going to escalate the war. He used other words, but it's going to be much bigger involvement on our part. And then he tells them at the same time, we are bombing North Vietnam as I speak to you. And Congress again approves Johnson's decision to bomb North Vietnam and approved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and incident. The resolution authorizes now Johnson to take all necessary measures against communist forces in North and South Vietnam. Here's an example limited bombardment, flying off carriers, American ships. Johnson believed that by limited bombing of North Vietnam, this is limited, that would persuade Ho Chi Minh to stop aiding the Viet Cong. That's what they're demanding now in South Vietnam. But it didn't work. And it's election time, November 1964, and LBJ wins, as he thought, a landslide. Johnson's now comfortable in really upping the ante of the war against the North and the Viet Cong in the South. And he institutes this, Operation Rolling Thunder. That's a B-52. And it's, at first, limited bombing of North Vietnam, but that didn't work. And now he escalates that and dramatically now increases the bombing of North Vietnam. And then he launches one of the biggest air campaigns ever, including World War II. And the Chief of Staff, you may remember him, U.S. Air Force, Curtis LeMay. And I'll quote what he said, "We're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age." End of quote. So that's what he's saying with this. The bombing campaign, it was to last 8 weeks, 2 months. In fact, it lasted 3 years. They were bombing 3 years, the North. And what you see here, a B-52 heavy bomber carries a lot of bomb load. Despite such a bombing campaign, however, in Vietnam, they refused to stop, the North refused to stop supplying the Viet Cong in the South, and they began to send now large numbers of troops, Viet Minh regular soldiers. They were originally guerrillas, then they were retrained to become regular soldiers in the North by that General Giap. And the anti-war protests now, it begins, but it's only on a very low grade in the United States. No big thing at all. Rock songs become popular. And maybe you remember some of these. Killing Me Safely, do you remember that? Yeah. Bridge Over Troubled Waters, Born to Be Wild. All of that started to come out as part of some dissatisfaction on the part of especially young people of the war in Vietnam. But more about opposition to the war in short order or later in my lecture. So the Viet Cong now, they continue to grow in strength in South Vietnam. And after several Viet Cong attacks on U.S. Army forces there, 3,000 Marines now are brought to Vietnam, U.S. Marines, dispatched there to fight, hoping that it would increase the American ante. This marked the beginning of an active U.S. ground war with those Marines and others there. And the U.S. public opinion now overwhelmingly, because they think things are going, especially with the Marines, and they're going to be increased, and all of the other American soldiers are going to be dramatically increased. So they overwhelmingly supported the war at this stage. 3,500 Marines now, in addition, making it a total of 3,500, and quickly increased to almost 200,000 were now brought into the fight. In the meantime, forces were experiencing heavy losses. This is the ARVN, they were increased too in size, but they're experiencing heavy losses at the hands of the communists. Desertion takes place, morale plummets on their part. And that brings us now to the most bombed nation ever, but I'm going to get off of this, and that was Cambodia, I believe. And this is the type of ordnance that was used, but we'll get off of that quickly. And that brings us now to General Westmoreland. He was a long story, but suffice it to say that Westy, that was his nickname, he headed up the U.S. military forces in Vietnam, 1964 to 1968. And Westy, they called him, he advocated an aggressive departure from America's defensive posture by increasing the number of American troops in Vietnam dramatically, which meant that an open-handed U.S. troop commitment, if he had anything to say with it, went from about 46,000 in 1964, that includes the Marines too, 46,000 to guess what? He increased it to 540,000 Americans operating in 1968 against the communists. And he predicted victory very soon, but in reality was that victory, it was not taking place. Communist forces began to become stronger rather than weaker. And then there's General Creighton Abrams, and he's assigned now to go back and retrain the South domestic army. So there's a lot of confusion going on. Westy wants rid of him. He's brought in to bring most of the Southern soldiers into better training and on. That was called Vietnamization. Vietnamization. Increase the number of soldiers living in the South. However, all of this, it culminated in the communist, and this is the most important thing of it all, the communist Tet Offensive in 1968. And I'll talk about that too in a minute. Now here you see, this is the Vietcong that America was fighting against, the Vietcong. They were the military arm, as I said, of the NFL, the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam. They were the right arm, so to speak, of the NFL. And note on this slide, this is what gets me, flimsy uniforms, if some didn't even have them, old weapons, some of them didn't have them, and even not sure if all of them had shoes. This is the Viet Cong. But as the war went on, these guerrillas, they were joined by more professional soldiers, as I said, the NVA from the north, trained soldiers from North Vietnam with more modern weapons and so on, most of it supplied by Russia and communist China. Interesting book. Boy, if you want to know more about Vietnam, boy, this is one of the important books to read. And it was written by Mao Zedong. He was the leader of communist China, came to power in 1949. It's a fascinating book. Almost, what time is it now? Well, it's past 8 already. So I've got to move fast on this. How could a peasant, here was a big question on the part of Mao Zedong. Here it is, and I quote him. How could peasant soldiers like these that I've showed you in the previous slide, in the picture, the previous slide, how could they stand up to a modern army like the United States Army or the French Army when they used to be there? He answered it in this way. Two things. Involve the enemy in a long, drawn-out war will demoralize them that way. No matter how many they kill of us, we're not going to give up, and we're going to drag this war out to infinity if it takes that long. And second, very important, get the population on the side of these guys, the Viet Cong. get them on your side. And that enables you to hide if it's necessary. That enables you to obtain water and food. That enables you to get intelligence about the enemy. Look at this. This is amazing. We just talked about it, the Chu Chi Tunnel Complex, built by the Vietcong. Several of these underground, always near villages that may or may not be sympathetic to them. Note the caverns which contained generators. And the generators work by a man on a bicycle, pumping all the time. First aid stations are here with surgical instruments, kitchen, printing press, ammunition dumps, a place to make landmines. Even a dormitory is in there. The Chi Chi Tunnel Complex, one of the ways that they fought the American Army. And by the way, let's see if I have that. A friend of mine was there, and it looks like this. Look how narrow that is. I don't think many of us could get inside that complex. Although my friend, he went with his wife recently to visit. It's a museum now. And his wife's slender and so on. And she got in, no problem. Got out, no problem. Now, he tried to get in, and he's a big guy. There's no way. He's typically the size of an American soldier. No way that he could get in. So that's the Chi Chi Tunnel Complex. That's a museum now in Vietnam. Quickly on this, this was a strategic hamlet program, cost the United States millions and millions of dollars. What happened was to isolate the peasants from the Viet Cong, they forced most of the peasants into complexes like this. In fact, in 1963, get this, over 8.5 million people were forced by the government into this type of thing. One peasant even put it this way: the government soldiers, they come by in the daytime. They don't do anything unless we demand money. They do very little. But the Viet Cong, they come by at night. And watch out if you're not sympathetic to them. So the program, it was a complete failure, and it went out of business after Diem was overthrown. Again, millions and millions of dollars put up by the United States. We're going to skip this one, and we'll go to this. And I'm going to show you both sides now. You're going to see the weapons and the method that the Viet Cong used, and then the methods and so on, the way the the American forces. These are booby traps. Vietnamese, Viet Cong booby traps. And they're covered by undergrowth, you can see there, and very dangerous because those prongs, which are smeared with excrement, they're designed to make a careless soldier trip and fall, and sometimes tearing the skin on his ankles and feet and legs and causing an infection, sometimes a severe infection, meaning that that soldier has to be pulled from the battlefield. So you've got one less soldier on the battlefield. Here's something. These are bamboo sticks. Anybody falling on that, and you're dead. Here's a trap, or rather a prong on a can, and very often a soldier may step on that prong and cut his feet, but worse than that, if he stepped hard enough, there's an explosive at the bottom of that can, and off comes one's foot or leg. Here's homemade grenades. And look what it says. It's an orange drink, a domestic, American, or something, some part in the world drink. And the point is, you can't leave this type of potential weapon on a road. Whether it's an American or an Arvin, that has to be taken and discarded some way. Here's some homemade weapons early on. Later, they were supplied with modern weapons. Here's a Coke grenade, and this is filled with explosives. And here are what they call the VC, using C rations. And what happened with the C rations is these are left along the roadside by both Americans and Arvin. Well, guess who takes these things up and they make them weapons? And just a couple more. This is a horrible thing. You step on this, that's a dud left by American or South Vietnamese forces, left on the side, a dud. And you step on that thing, and that'll blow up not only the person that steps on them, but all of the soldiers in the area. Here's another weapon, more modern now, supplied by China to the Vietcong. And then as the war went on, the Vietcong, they're supplied with much more modern weapons. This is just an example. In the Soviet Union, both of them supply it lavishly. Now the other side of the story, the helicopter. Helicopter gave the US and the Arvin mobility. In other words, in short spans of time, US and Arvin troops, they could just call up for a helicopter, and that helicopter was there fast, leaving little rest, therefore, for the enemy. Here, this is towards the end of the war, used, I think, well, limited use in Vietnam, but look at the firepower of this thing. Woe to any enemy that this is firing them. And with a few minutes, US, and Arvin forces are on the ground with a weapon like this. They had little chance with that. And here, look at the firepower here. This is a World War II C-47 aircraft used in part by the French, also by the Arvin. And those are Gatling guns coming out of the side, high-speed machine guns. And this could hover above the battlefield, if there's a battlefield, and woe to the enemy when this starts to fire. The helicopters were the workhorses of the Vietnam War. And this is called Puff the Magic Dragon. Here's a Sky Raider, US Sky Raider. Just take a look at the ordnance that it drops. And here you see the saturation bombing again. Woe to any of the enemy if they're in the open, whether it's daytime or nighttime. They don't stand a chance with something like this. That's a B-52. They called it saturation bombing. And finally this. And I knew someone who knew quite a bit about this. This is called a beehive projectile. It's fired by a cannon at the enemy coming at you, and the enemy would come in mass very often. And a few seconds after this leaves the barrel, it explodes, and 2,000 projectiles come out, hit the enemy, all of them coming at you. So it was used to defend against human wave tactics that the Vietcong and even the Arvin were taught. Not the Arvin, but the Viet Minh soldiers from the north. So it could explode, destroy a lot of people. One example, how could the United States, again, have lost the Vietnam War with this type of firepower? I hear that all the time. I question that myself, too. You probably have a better answer. He was there for 2 years or 3 as a captain in Vietnam. Well, I suggest, again, that you read that little guerrilla book, and it'll tell you in great parts. Here's the last chapter, and very important. This is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Amazing, known as the Strategic Supply Route. Now get this. According to the U.S. National Security Agency, this trail was one of the greatest achievements of military history in the 20th century. The trail is an entire lecture, believe me, unto itself. But suffice it to say the following. First, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that's what it's called. It was not just a trail. It was a complex web of trails, paths that enabled communists to go from the north to the south, many of them to support the troops in the south, and during the entire American war in Vietnam. Now, next, much of the supplies to the Vietcong, it came down this trail. And at regular intervals, it came down. There were base camps on these trails, storage units, supply areas, sanctuaries, even hospitals were on this trail, going from north to south. And much of the trail was concealed by an elaborate, intricate formation of man-made camouflage that was constantly tended to, get this, constantly, 24/7, by 45,000 people full-time, and then another 40 or 45, another 20 or 25,000 working part-time, day and night, 24/7. And in the early days, it took 6 months to get from the north to the south, but by 1970, it took 6 weeks. And the United States Air Force, it was flying many missions against it, but they were able to repair it as fast as they were able to blow some of it up. However, for the most part, the trail, 1,000 miles long, 1,000 miles in length, it was kept open, and supplies and soldiers and equipment, it was able to get to their destination despite interference. My guess is that without this famous trail, the communists would have lost the war. Here quickly, defoliants to destroy rice crops and so on. Here you see a terrible thing. Sometimes the long-term effects of that material being dropped. Here, skip that. And now we come to the infamous or the famous Tet Offensive. And this is 44. The Tet Offensive, January 1968. It was the biggest communist offensive in the Vietnam War, by far. And it took place January 1968. You were there, you said 68. And was a campaign of communist surprise attacks against military and civilian targets throughout much of South Vietnam and even at the bottom of North Vietnam. And the name of the offensive was the Tet Offensive, for the Tet holiday, the Vietnamese New Year. That's when it took place. And here you see on a map, very little of it, but all those red marks, they were simultaneously attacked by the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh, simultaneously. 80,000 Viet Cong and many, many Viet Minh together. All of them, 80,000, attacked 100 of those marks, red marks. Could be financial capitals, villages, towns, you name it, 100 of them were simultaneously attacked. And the initial attacks stunned, of course, the United States and the South Vietnamese forces. They were stunned. But they quickly regrouped. That's what's amazing. The United States was able to regroup along with their followers, the South Vietnamese soldiers, inflicting very heavy casualties on all of these 80,000 or so Vietcong and others attacking. And as it really turned out, it wasn't a victory for the Vietcong. It turned out it was a victory, finally, for the United States and the ARVN. It had a profound effect now on America, the government, and shocked the hell out of U.S. public, which had always been believing that we're winning the war. The media was telling them that, friends and relatives and newspapers and all of that, we were winning the war. And but the U.S. Military leaders, especially Westmoreland, he too joined on. We're winning the war. Just give me more soldiers, but we're winning the war. The communists are losing the war until Tet. And the war, was looked down by both the media and the American public with, well, with sympathy. It wasn't intense yet, but sympathy. But now, 6 weeks after the Tet offensive, the public approval begins to really wane, and in fact, it begins to nosedive after the Tet offensive. And the American media now, it turns temporarily on Westmoreland. He's shortly thereafter fired. They jump on President Johnson and all of the war in Vietnam. Until the Tet offensive, the media, the American people were generally, as I say, generally supportive of the war. But then after this, and how were they able to bring all of this together? How were they able to bring 80,000 troops and guerrillas together to simultaneously attack all of these targets? Now, General Giap, he headed up Viet Minh and the Viet Cong. He was the leader of the communist forces. And here's what he said, two things. Despite the surprise attack, we were, he admits it now, we were on the ropes. And due to our very, very heavy losses. He used it twice, very, very heavy communist losses. And second, but despite our heavy losses, the battle turned out to be, from a practical point of view, it turned out to be, again, heavy losses, but here's what's important, but strategically, not tactically, but strategically, it was a major victory for the communist forces. And why? Because now the American media really jumped on the war, against the war. The American public now, as its involvement in the war, the public is becoming now disgusted with the war. And here's what you see, which goes around the world. Here's an execution around the world. And then the horror of war goes around the world, how it's being blamed on, not the communists anymore, but it's blamed on the United States. And war is hell, and it sure is. The horror of war. And that brings us now to President Johnson. So those photographs went around the world, and especially throughout the United States. And brings Johnson now to the surface. Look at his face. And Johnson, and that's Secretary of Defense McNamara. We'll talk about him shortly. And Johnson wants out. He could no longer take war anymore, and you could see it on his face. So in March 1968, he says that he will not run anymore as president. And now that brings us to President Nixon shortly thereafter. This is a whole story unto itself, but he promises, and he meant it, to end the war by achieving, and he is asking for an honorable peace. Well, by 1969, easier said than done, the communist forces continue to fight this quagmire, and Nixon, he wants out. Again, sort of a whole story unto itself, but let's go here, and if you have a chance, look at that. There's a peace talks begin. He's pushing for peace talks. The communists issue a 10-point plan, all of it in their favor. And the Vietnamese government you get all of that? The Vietnamese southern government, they refuse to join with North Vietnam. They want no part of it. And it's, again, Vietnamization. The Americans now, under Nixon, are going to bring them home slowly, and this is Vietnamization, trying to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese, Arvin. Last chapter. This is called the Phoenix program, but I'm going to pass on that for the moment. But now it's opposition, hardcore opposition to the war. 54, hardcore, you can see it now. This is beginning to happen all over the country. At a low level in 1964, but it's really going to escalate after what happened at Tent. And you see this too going all over the country. And then on top of that, we see this. The My Lai massacre, remember that? Lieutenant Calley, 504 women and children killed, made much of the all over the TV sets, day in and day out, actively brandished by the media over and over again. Oops. Back to Nixon. He invades Cambodia out of desperation, but the truth of the matter was there was no war in Cambodia. They had fled and left. There was only empty ditches and empty other places for equipment. That's what happened, but that's a full story. In fact, what was he called? They gave him a name, the media. I don't remember what it is, but they did. And this brings us now, remember this, the student protest at Kent State. So the invasion, this invasion of Cambodia was like an accelerator, even though nothing really happened there. But it was known that Vietcong were hiding at times as the Arvin chased them and the American army chased them, so they would hide sometimes in Cambodia. But there was no war in Cambodia. Okay, but the media, they used this invasion to help provoke a wave of demonstration throughout the United States. And one of the anti-war demonstrations, it took place here at Kent State University. Inexperienced guardsmen, National Guardsmen, they shoot into the pack of people. People are killed. I don't remember how many, but their students were killed. And then as a result, about 450 other universities temporarily closed down after this. And more on the part of war protesters. Here's another one. Anybody remember who she is? Anybody?
Fonda.
Jane Fonda, that's her. By 1972, Nixon's discouraged now, and he wants to end the war, period. And he'll do it basically on their terms. And the war has been going on since 1969. We've got to get out of there. But before he does, he tries one more blow on the communists and bombs the hell out of Hanoi and Haiphong, which was a water port up in the north. And a destructive power, someone said, was at a level similar to what went on in World War II all over Germany. They bombed and bombed and bombed. It put the communists, again, on the ropes, according to General General Jopp. So he's on the ropes again. So here's what he said. The American media, it came to our aid, again, to our aid, again, and they came just in the nick of time. They were ready to call uncle with this. But it didn't happen. Here's my very last chapter, the communist victory. And to make a long story short, President Nixon, January 1973, he agrees to sign the peace talks essentially on the communist terms, probably 95% on the communist terms. And the this scene helps to demonstrate that the war goes on for another 2 years. America's out of the war technically now, but it's still going on. But this time the communist forces, heavily supported by China and Russia with everything new, against South Vietnam. And it didn't take too long, a couple more years, and they gave up. And the result was victory by North Vietnam over South Vietnam, and then on April 30th, 1975, South Vietnam surrenders to the communists. Here are a couple of slides. People now fleeing South Vietnam. These are people from the city of Saigon, American helicopters up there. They're frightened. They're going to have to give up maybe their wealth to the communists. Here's another evacuation, just fear and frightened on the part of South Vietnamese people, and hundreds of thousands leave. Look at this, 1,000 pictures, or 1,000 words, I mean, can be a picture. These are young people. What's going to happen to them? They have no idea. Where are they going to go? And finally, boat people. And these are people fleeing South Vietnam primarily, looking for places in Southeast Asia to move to. And here is the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, and at the wall, the names of all American killed on the Vietnam War, and that was between 1955 and they were there, some of them, until 1975. 58,286 killed. So this doesn't count those that were wounded or missing in action. And finally, the victory. And here are the Fog of War. Interesting book, interesting, very interesting movie. McNamara, under two administrations, Johnson and Kennedy. And here's what he listed. Here's some of what he said about the war and the American presence, and then the victory on the part of the enemy. So, with that said, give you another minute to look it over. And he said, too, we don't have the God even right to shape Vietnam into our views, our image, and so on. And with that said, that's the end. And I enjoyed being with you, and thank you.